The Queen of England stared at the ring on my hand as if she'd just seen a ghost step out of the ground. The ballroom at Buckingham Palace had gone so quiet I could hear the soft clink of silver against crystal from somewhere behind me. Officers in dress uniforms, diplomats with polished smiles, women in evening gowns the color of old roses and champagne, all of them seemed to freeze in place while Her Majesty kept her eyes fixed on my father's ring. "Who gave you this?" she asked. Not loud, not theatrical, just low and sharp with the kind of control that somehow made the question feel heavier. I remember swallowing hard and answering in the only way I could. "It belonged to my father, ma'am." Her face changed then, not with fear exactly, more like recognition mixed with something older, regret maybe, or grief. She reached out not to take the ring but as if she wanted to make sure she was truly seeing it. "What was your father's name?" "Jack Mitchell," I said. "Retired Navy SEAL, from North Carolina." The Queen drew in a slow breath and the look in her eyes told me one thing before she said another word. My father had lied to me by omission for my entire life. Or maybe lied was too harsh. Maybe he had simply taken part of himself and buried it so deep no one was ever meant to find it. That was the moment everything changed. But to understand why a queen would turn pale at the sight of an old signet ring in the hand of a U.S. Marine, you have to go back to the week my father died to the small town where I grew up, where men still tipped their hats at funerals, and women brought casseroles without being asked. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a Marine. I was 38 years old when my father passed, and until that spring I thought I understood the shape of his life. I was wrong. My father died on a Thursday morning in late April, just after sunrise. That's what the hospice nurse told me over the phone while I was on base at Camp Lejeune. Her voice was gentle and practiced the way people sound when they've delivered the same kind of sorrow 100 times before. "He went peacefully," she said. Peacefully. I thanked her, hung up, and sat on the edge of my bunk for a while with my phone still in my hand, staring at the cinderblock wall like it might explain something. My father, Jack Mitchell, was 72 years old. Retired Navy SEAL, Vietnam-era enlistment, though he never liked labels and never once said a word to me about combat. After the military, he came home to Carteret County, North Carolina, and worked as a boat mechanic at a marina near Morehead City for more than 30 years. Folks around town knew him as steady, quiet, dependable, the kind of man who'd fix your engine without overcharging you, shake your hand once and mean it. He lived alone after my mother passed. Same white clapboard house, same screened porch, same coffee mug with the chipped handle he refused to throw out. I drove home that afternoon in silence. The roads of eastern North Carolina in spring have a softness to them. Pine trees, marsh grass, weathered mailboxes, the smell of salt carried in from the coast. The kind of roads that make you think about your life whether you want to or not. By the time I pulled into Dad's gravel driveway, the sun was low and yellow, and his house looked smaller than I remembered. Not sad, just tired. Miss Ellen from next door was already there, sitting on the porch with a covered dish in her lap. She stood when she saw me and hugged me before I could say a word. "I made chicken pie," she said, "because that's what people say in towns like ours when grief is too big for language." "Thank you." "He was a good man, Sarah." "Yes, ma'am," I said, and that was all I trusted myself to say. Inside the house smelled like old wood black coffee and the faint trace of Dad's shaving cream. His reading glasses were still on the kitchen table. His cap still hung by the back door. A paperback novel lay face down in the living room beside his chair, one finger width from where he'd set it aside for the last time. That nearly broke me. Not the hospital bed in the den, not the folded blankets, not the unopened mail. The book. Because it was ordinary. Because grief, I've learned, doesn't always come for you in grand moments. Sometimes it gets you through the little things that prove life kept moving right up until it didn't. The funeral was held on Saturday at the small Baptist church my mother used to attend. Dad only went on Christmas and Easter, but the pastor knew him, and in a town that size, that was enough. I wore my dark civilian suit instead of my Marine uniform. It felt more respectful somehow, more like a daughter and less like an officer. Attendance was sparse. That would have embarrassed some families, but it seemed to suit my father. Miss Ellen came. The marina owner came. 2 men I remembered from the diner sat in the back with their hands folded in their laps. and 3 elderly veterans I had never met stood together near the side aisle, all in plain dark jackets, ramrod straight despite their age. They didn't speak to anyone. When the service ended and the casket was carried out, those 3 men raised their hands in a crisp salute. No one else in the church seemed to understand what that meant. I did. I walked over to them afterward by the graveside. "Did you know my father?" I asked. The tallest of the 3, a lean white-haired man with a jaw like carved oak, looked at me for a long second. "Yes," he said. "From the teams." He glanced at the other 2, from a long time ago. I waited for more, but none came. "I'm his daughter." "We know who you are," the man said. That should have irritated me, but it didn't. There was no threat in his tone, just old caution. Then he looked at the flag folded by the graveside detail and said quietly, "Your father was the kind of man who carried weight for other people. Some of it wasn't his to carry." Before I could ask what that meant, they turned and walked away. That night alone in Dad's house, I started sorting through his things. Anyone who has done that for a parent knows the strange intimacy of it. You open drawers they closed for decades. You find receipts, photos, warranty cards for appliances that no longer exist. A life becomes paper cloth and dust in your hands. Dad kept things neat. Socks rolled, bills stacked, tools hung in order on pegboards in the garage. His bedroom closet held 3 plaid shirts, 2 jackets, 1 black suit, and a line of old jeans. It was the brown leather jacket that caught my attention. He'd worn it my whole life, especially in the fall. The elbows were worn pale and one cuff had a cracked seam my mother used to nag him about repairing. I lifted it from the hanger, meaning only to fold it into a donation box. But the weight in one pocket stopped me. At first I thought it was a coin. I reached inside and pulled out a ring. Heavy. Gold, though not bright. Old enough that the metal had softened with wear. The face of it bore an engraved crest I didn't recognize, crown shield flourishes around the edges. Not flashy, formal, European-looking. Definitely not something my father would ever have bought for himself. I stood there in that quiet bedroom with the ring in my palm, listening to the ceiling fan hum overhead. Then I slipped it onto my finger. It fit. Not perfectly, but close enough to make my stomach tighten. My father had never worn jewelry, not even his wedding band, after my mother died. So why had he kept this hidden in an old jacket pocket? Why not in a drawer or a safe or a box with other keepsakes? I turned it toward the lamp and saw tiny letters engraved on the inside band. The script was so fine I had to squint. Not a full name, just initials. E.M. I sat down on the edge of Dad's bed with the ring still on my hand and looked around the room as if he might step in and explain it in that calm, spare way of his. But all I had was silence, and the uneasy feeling that the man I buried that morning had taken his most important story with him. I didn't sleep much that night after finding the ring. The house creaked the way old houses do when the temperature drops after sunset. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Every once in a while a truck rolled down the highway a mile away, the sound drifting through the pine trees like a slow wave. I sat at my father's kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the ring turning slowly between my fingers. The crest bothered me. Not because it looked expensive, it didn't. The gold was worn smooth from age. What bothered me was that the design felt official, formal, the kind of symbol that meant something to someone important. And my father had hidden it in a jacket pocket. Not in a drawer. Not in a safe. Hidden. I kept turning it over until the small engraving inside the band caught the light again. E.M. 2 letters. That was it. My father had lived his whole life like that, short sentences, small answers, long silences. When I was a kid, I used to think he was just shy. Later, I understood something different. Men who have seen certain things often choose quiet. I finally slipped the ring back onto my finger and leaned back in the chair. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to really think about my father's military career. Retired Navy SEAL. That was the official version. The one on his service records. The one printed in small type on the funeral program. But when I was growing up, that phrase had always felt strangely incomplete. Dad never talked about the teams. Not once. Some veterans tell stories at the dinner table about boot camp, about crazy officers, about long deployments. My father never did. If I asked questions when I was younger, he would smile slightly and say the same thing every time. Most stories aren't worth repeating. Then he'd change the subject. When I was 16, I found an old photograph in the garage. It showed my father standing beside 3 other men in military gear somewhere that looked cold and rocky. The picture had no date and no location written on it. I brought it inside and asked him where it was taken. He looked at the photo for a long moment. Then he said just a training exercise. And that was the end of it. Now, sitting in that kitchen 22 years later with the ring on my finger, I wondered if that had been a lie. Not a malicious lie. Just an omission. The next morning I drove down to the marina. The air smelled like salt and diesel fuel the way it always had. Fishing boats rocked gently against the dock, their rigging clinking in the breeze. A few gulls circled overhead yelling about something only gulls understand. The marina office was a small wooden building with peeling white paint and a Coke machine out front. Inside, the owner, Mr. Calhoun, sat behind the counter reading the newspaper. He looked up when I stepped in. "Well, I'll be," he said softly, "Sarah Mitchell." "Morning, Mr. Calhoun." He stood up slowly, walked around the counter, and gave me a firm handshake. "Your daddy was one of the best mechanics I ever had." "I know." He could listen to an engine for 10 seconds and tell you exactly what was wrong with it. "That sounds like him." Mr. Calhoun studied my face for a moment, the way older men sometimes do when they're measuring grief. "You holding up all right?" "I think so." He nodded. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things, boat repairs, whether the shrimp season coming up, small talk that felt comforting in its familiarity. Then his eyes dropped to my hand, to the ring. His expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes. "Where'd you get that?" he asked. "My father's jacket." He leaned a little closer. "Mind if I take a look?" I slid the ring off and handed it to him. He turned it over slowly, running his thumb across the crest. "Well," he said quietly, "you recognize it." Mr. Calhoun didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the window and looked out at the boats rocking in the water. After a long moment, he turned back to me. "You ever ask your daddy about England?" "Number." That was all he said. "Mr. Calhoun," I said carefully, "if you know something." He shook his head. "I don't know much, just pieces." "Pieces of what?" "Old stories." I waited. He handed the ring back to me. "Your father carried more secrets than most men I ever met." That sentence sounded familiar. One of the veterans at the funeral had said almost the exact same thing. "What kind of secrets?" I asked. Mr. Calhoun sighed. "The kind you don't go digging into unless you're ready for what you find." I slipped the ring back on my finger. "Well, I said I'm already digging." He studied me again. "You always were stubborn." "That's what Dad used to say." He gave a quiet chuckle. Yeah, he was proud of that. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that stayed with me. "Your daddy once disappeared for 6 months." I blinked. "When?" "Had to be mid-80s maybe. He told everyone he was visiting friends up north." "Did you believe him?" Mr. Calhoun shrugged. "I believed he had reasons." That was it. No dramatic reveal. No secret documents. Just another small crack in the quiet story of Jack Mitchell's life. By the time I left the marina, the sun was higher and the docks were filling with fishermen preparing their boats. Life continuing the way it always does. I drove back to my father's house, packed my bags, and prepared to return to Camp Lejeune. The Marine Corps doesn't pause for grief very long. 2 weeks later, I was back in uniform. Morning drills, briefings, weapons checks. The familiar rhythm of military life wrapped around me again like a well-worn jacket. In some ways, it felt comforting. Structure helps when your mind won't sit still. One afternoon, my commanding officer called me into his office. "Mitchell," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "You're on the list for a joint NATO training program." "Where, sir?" "London." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were travel orders, schedules, and briefing notes. London. I don't know why the word made the ring suddenly feel heavier on my hand. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. 2 weeks later, I boarded a military transport flight with a handful of other Marines headed across the Atlantic. The flight lasted 8 hours. Most of the guys slept. I spent most of the time staring out the small oval window at the clouds and turning the ring slowly around my finger. When the plane finally descended over the English countryside, the land below looked like a patchwork quilt of green fields and narrow roads. Old country. Older than anything in North Carolina. When we landed, a British officer greeted us with polite efficiency and loaded us onto a transport bus headed into the city. London rose around us in layers of history, stone buildings, old bridges, narrow streets filled with taxis and red buses. A few days into the training program, our unit received invitations to attend a formal NATO reception. Location: Buckingham Palace. Dress uniform required. I remember standing in front of the mirror that evening adjusting my marine dress blues. The jacket fit perfectly. Medals aligned. Shoes polished. The ring glinted faintly under the light. I considered taking it off, but something stopped me. So I left it where it was. That decision changed everything. Because less than 2 hours later, inside one of the most famous buildings in the world, the Queen of England would look down at my hand and turn pale. By the time our convoy reached Buckingham Palace, dusk had settled over London like a layer of blue silk. I had seen pictures of the place all my life, same as most Americans, but standing in front of it was something else entirely. The gates gleamed black and gold beneath the lamps. The stone facade looked older than memory itself, the kind of building that seemed less constructed than inherited from another age. Even the air felt different there, cooler, stiller, touched by rain and centuries. The British staff moved with practiced calm, guiding military guests through the entrance in a steady line. Dress uniforms from half a dozen nations filled the halls: American Marines and Navy officers, British Army and Royal Navy brass Canadian representatives, a few diplomats whose medals looked older than I was. There was polite conversation, low laughter, the soft shuffle of polished shoes against gleaming floors. And underneath all of it there was ceremony. Not the sharp, efficient ceremony I knew from the Marine Corps. Something older, slower, more layered. I remember thinking my father would have hated it. Too much display, too much velvet and gilt and silent judgment in the paintings on the walls. Then again, I wasn't so sure anymore what my father would have hated. I stood with 2 other Marines near the edge of a receiving room so grand it hardly seemed real. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen rain. Portraits of kings and generals looked down from towering frames. Silver trays floated through the crowd in the hands of white-gloved attendants. Somewhere a string quartet played softly enough to sound almost distant. I had the strange sensation of being in 2 worlds at once. In one, I was Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Marine, representing my country at an Allied military function. In the other, I was still a daughter from coastal North Carolina, wearing a mystery on her hand that had followed her across the ocean. I found myself touching the ring twice before anyone important had even entered the room. When the announcement came that Her Majesty had arrived, the room shifted in an instant. Not chaotic, just unified. Conversations softened, shoulders straightened, glasses lowered. Every person present seemed to turn almost as one body. Then she entered. I won't overstate the moment. Americans have a different relationship to royalty than the British do. We don't bow from instinct. We don't grow up under crowns. But there was still a gravity to her presence that surprised me. She was smaller than I expected and older, of course, but there was nothing frail about the way she carried herself. She moved with the kind of confidence that comes from having spent a lifetime watched by the entire world. She greeted people as she moved through the room with brief words, small smiles, and eyes that missed very little. I told myself not to be ridiculous. She would never notice me. There were too many guests, too many officers, too many polished decorations in that room. But line by line, step by measured step, she drew closer to our section. A British aide murmured introductions as she moved along. A colonel from Ottawa, a NATO logistics officer, an American admiral. Then somehow she was in front of me. The aide glanced at a card. Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, United States Marine Corps, ma'am. I inclined my head politely, careful and respectful, not overdoing it. Your Majesty. She looked up at me with a pleasant, formal expression. A Marine, she said. That is a demanding life, I imagine. Yes, ma'am. And your first time in London? Yes, ma'am. Her gaze dropped, perhaps simply from habit, to the hands clasped lightly in front of me. Then she saw the ring. Everything in her face changed. It was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. She did not gasp or step back. But the warmth left her expression at once. The color seemed to drain from her cheeks. Her eyes locked on the signet ring with such force that for one suspended second, I forgot where I was. The aide noticed it too and fell silent. The Queen leaned the slightest bit closer. "Who gave you this?" Her voice was low, but it cut through me. I glanced once at the aide, once at the British officer standing behind her, then back to her face. "It belonged to my father, ma'am." She did not take her eyes off the ring. "Your father's name?" "Jack Mitchell." That did it. I saw it land. Not just recognition, something deeper. The kind of recognition that carries memory with it, memory weighted by time. "Jack Mitchell," she repeated almost to herself. "Yes, ma'am, he was a retired Navy SEAL from North Carolina." For a moment the room around us seemed to fade. There was still music somewhere, still conversation somewhere beyond our little circle, but I couldn't hear any of it clearly. The Queen lifted her gaze to mine. "How long have you had that ring?" "Only a few weeks. I found it after he passed away." Her eyes stayed on me, reading something in my face, or maybe in his. "I see." An aide stepped slightly forward as if to move the line along, but she gave the barest motion of one hand and he stopped. Then she said very quietly, "Would you come with us? Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell." That got the attention of everyone within earshot. The British aide's posture tightened. One of the American officers nearby looked openly confused, and I, standing there in my dress blues under a chandelier in Buckingham Palace, had no idea whether I was being honored, questioned, or pulled into something I would rather not know. "Yes, ma'am," I said. She turned and began walking toward a side corridor, not fast, but with certainty. The aide motioned for me to follow. Another staff member stepped discreetly between us and the room, shielding the departure from broader notice. Within seconds I was out of the ballroom and into a quieter hall lined with portraits, gilt mirrors and carpets so thick my footsteps nearly disappeared. The Queen led us into a small sitting room. It was elegant, of course, but simpler than the grand rooms outside. A fireplace, 2 upholstered chairs, a writing desk near the window, a few framed photographs that gave the space the feel of somewhere actually used, not just displayed. She turned to face me once the door closed. "Please," she said, gesturing to a chair, "sit down." I sat, though every instinct from the Marine Corps told me to remain standing. The aide stayed by the door. Another older gentleman, introduced only as Sir Malcolm, entered quietly and took a place near the fireplace. He looked not military but official in some deeper, older way. The Queen's eyes returned to my hand. "May I see the ring?" I removed it and handed it over. She held it with surprising steadiness for someone her age, turning it toward the light. Her thumb brushed over the crest, then the inner engraving. "Yes," she said softly, "I thought so." "What is it?" I asked. She looked up at me, and I noticed that whatever initial shock had overtaken her was now replaced by composure, though not indifference. There was emotion there, carefully bridled. "This ring," she said, "belonged to a man in service to the Crown many years ago." I felt my pulse quicken. "A British officer." "A British operative," said Sir Malcolm from the fireplace. His voice was clipped and precise, though not one history has ever spoken of publicly. I looked from him back to the Queen. How did my father get it? For the first time since leaving the ballroom, the Queen seemed to hesitate. Then she asked, "What did your father ever tell you about his service?" "Almost nothing." A faint, sad understanding passed across her face, as though that answer fit a pattern she had expected. "Yes," she said, "that would be consistent." I leaned forward in the chair before I meant to. "With respect, ma'am, my father is dead. If there's something I should know, I'd like to hear it." The Queen folded her hands lightly in her lap. "There was an operation," she said, "during the latter years of the Cold War. Officially, it never occurred. Unofficially, it prevented the deaths of several British personnel and the exposure of matters that might have had grave international consequences." Sir Malcolm added, "It went catastrophically wrong." I sat very still. The Queen looked down at the ring again. "One man should have died that night," she said. "The owner of this ring. Yet he did not, because an American intervened. My father—" She met my eyes. "Yes." I felt something cold move through me. "No," I said automatically, though I had no reason to say it. "My father was in the Navy, American operations. He wasn't—" "He was where he needed to be," Sir Malcolm said. I turned sharply toward him. "That doesn't explain anything." "No," he said evenly, "it does not." The Queen lifted one hand not to silence me but to soften the edge in the room. "Your father," she said, "performed an act of extraordinary courage on behalf of people he did not know, under circumstances in which no recognition could ever be publicly offered." My throat tightened. Then why keep the ring? At that, the Queen's expression changed again. Not shock this time, memory. Because she said it was pressed into his hand by a dying man who asked him to carry proof home should the truth ever become necessary. No one spoke for several seconds. I stared at the ring in her hand, trying to connect that old piece of gold to the man who drank black coffee on a screened porch in North Carolina and spent his Saturdays rebuilding outboard motors for neighbors. It did not fit. And yet somehow it did. "What truth?" I asked. Sir Malcolm and the Queen exchanged a brief glance. Then the Queen said, "The truth that your father was never fully credited for what happened, and the truth that another man was." That was the first spark. Not grief. Not mystery. Anger. Quiet at first, but unmistakable. I felt it settle in my chest like a coal dropped into ash. My father had hidden this his whole life. Fine. That was his choice. But if someone else had taken what was his duty, his sacrifice, his history, then that was not silence. That was theft. And for the first time since I buried Jack Mitchell, I understood that whatever this story was, it had not ended with his death. It had only begun. For a few seconds after the Queen spoke, no one in that quiet room moved. The ring lay in her hand like a small piece of history that had finally surfaced after years underwater. I could hear the soft ticking of a clock somewhere behind me, and outside the window a distant carriage rolled across gravel. I tried to picture my father inside the story she had just hinted at. It didn't fit. My father fixing boat engines at the marina. My father drinking black coffee at the kitchen table. My father telling me that most stories weren't worth repeating. And yet here I was sitting inside Buckingham Palace being told that decades earlier he had stepped into the middle of an operation involving British intelligence. I cleared my throat. "With respect, ma'am," I said, "I don't understand why someone else would be credited for something he did." Sir Malcolm answered before she could. "Because certain truths are inconvenient at the time they occur." His tone was calm, but the words carried a weight to them. I turned toward him. "You mean politically inconvenient?" "Precisely." The Queen studied me for a moment before speaking again. "Your father intervened during a very delicate operation. British personnel had been compromised behind the Iron Curtain. An extraction attempt went poorly." "That's one way of putting it," Sir Malcolm added quietly. I leaned forward in the chair. "What happened?" Sir Malcolm folded his hands. "A convoy transporting our agents was ambushed. Communications failed. Command believed everyone inside had been killed or captured. But they weren't. Number, because of my father." Sir Malcolm gave the smallest nod. "He happened to be in the vicinity with a small American unit. Unofficially." "Unofficially," I repeated. "Yes, certain alliances require flexibility." The Queen gently placed the ring on the small table between us. "The man who owned that ring," she said, "was the senior British officer leading the extraction team. His name was Edward March." My eyes flicked to the engraving again. "E.M. Edward March. He died that night," she continued. "But before he did, he gave the ring to your father." My chest tightened. "Why?" Sir Malcolm answered. "Because your father carried him out of the firefight." The room felt suddenly smaller. "What?" "March was mortally wounded. Your father refused to leave him behind. According to the surviving reports, he carried the man nearly 2 miles under fire to reach the evacuation point." I felt my hands curl slowly around the arms of the chair. "That doesn't sound like something the Navy would keep quiet." "No," Sir Malcolm said. "Ordinarily it would not." "So what happened?" The Queen looked toward the window for a moment before answering. "When the operation ended, it was decided at levels far above anyone in this room that the official narrative would be simplified." I frowned. Simplified how? Credit for the mission was given to another officer. There it was again. That small coal of anger in my chest. "And my father returned home. Without recognition." "Yes." I stood up without meaning to. "Why would he accept that?" Sir Malcolm looked directly at me. "Because some men understand that recognition is not the same thing as honor. That answer might have satisfied someone else. It didn't satisfy me. With respect, I said my father worked 30 years fixing boat engines. Nobody ever knew he did something like that. And someone else got a medal for it. Neither of them argued. That silence told me more than any explanation. Finally, I asked the question that had been forming since the moment the Queen turned pale in the ballroom. Who took the credit? Sir Malcolm didn't answer right away. He walked slowly to the fireplace and stared into it as if the flames might rearrange the past. Then he said a name. Colonel Richard Halstead. The name meant nothing to me. But the Queen's expression changed slightly. He became quite famous afterward, she said. Sir Malcolm nodded. A celebrated intelligence officer, books written about him, interviews, honors. I felt something shift inside my chest. Not rage exactly. Something colder. My father never said a word. No, the Queen said softly, he did not. I paced slowly across the carpet. Did anyone ever try to correct the record? Sir Malcolm's expression hardened slightly. It is rarely simple to correct history once governments have agreed upon a version of it. So you just left it that way. That was the decision at the time. And now, the Queen looked down at the ring again. Now the man who carried the truth is gone. Her words settled into the room like dust. I stopped pacing. You're telling me the only proof is this ring? Sir Malcolm turned toward me. Not the only proof. That got my attention. What else? There are archived reports, testimonies from the surviving agents, operational logs. And why hasn't any of that come out? He gave a thin smile. Because no one has ever asked the right questions. The anger inside me shifted again. Not hot. Focused. You think I'm going to let it go? Sir Malcolm tilted his head. I think your father would have. I stared at him. Maybe he would. The Queen spoke before either of us could continue. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell. I turned back toward her. Your father made his choice, she said gently. He chose silence. I know. But you must decide what you will choose. The room went quiet again. I looked at the ring sitting on the small table. All my life my father had told me that service was about duty, not recognition. But something about this felt different. This wasn't about medals. This was about truth. I picked up the ring and slid it back onto my finger. If the records exist, I said slowly, then the truth exists. Sir Malcolm watched me carefully. Yes. And Colonel Halstead is still alive. He nodded. Retired, living in Virginia. That surprised me. Virginia. Near Arlington. Of course. Close enough to Washington to remain important. Close enough to power to stay comfortable. The Queen rose from her chair. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, she said, whatever path you take, remember this. I straightened instinctively. Your father acted out of courage, not recognition. I understand that, ma'am. And courage sometimes requires restraint. I nodded. But inside my mind something had already begun turning. Not revenge. Not exactly. Something quieter. More deliberate. If the truth about my father had been buried for 40 years, then maybe it was time someone dug it back up. And if Colonel Richard Halstead had built a legacy on that buried truth, then one day soon he and I were going to have a very long conversation. When I left Buckingham Palace that night, London looked different than it had a few hours earlier. The streets were the same wet pavement reflecting yellow streetlights, taxis sliding past in quiet lines, old buildings rising like shadows out of history. But something inside me had shifted. For most of my life, my father had been a quiet man with a modest story. Now I knew that story had been cut in half, and someone else had been living comfortably inside the missing piece. The transport bus carrying our group back to the NATO barracks moved slowly through evening traffic. Most of the Marines on board were talking about the reception, how strange it felt, being inside Buckingham Palace, what the Queen was like in person, who had the best view of the ballroom. I didn't say much. I sat by the window with my elbow resting against the glass, watching the lights pass, while my thumb turned the signet ring around and around on my finger. Colonel Richard Halstead. The name repeated in my mind like a quiet drumbeat. I had never heard of him before that evening, but when I finally got back to the barracks, I opened my laptop and started searching. The internet is a strange thing when you're looking for someone important. If a person lived an ordinary life, you find almost nothing. But if they've spent decades inside government and military circles, their name echoes across articles, interviews, ceremony photographs. Richard Halstead's name echoed everywhere. Decorated intelligence officer, Cold War strategist, hero of a classified rescue mission in Eastern Europe in 1984. I stared at the screen for a long time. The article was from an old military magazine. There was even a photograph Halstead standing beside a helicopter, younger than jaw square, and confident, a medal pinned neatly to his uniform. The caption read, Colonel Richard Halstead credited with leading the daring extraction that saved British intelligence officers during a Cold War ambush. Credited. I leaned back slowly in the chair. So that was how history had written it. Halstead the hero. My father the mechanic. For a moment I felt anger rise again, sharp and immediate. But then something else followed it, something my father had drilled into me since childhood. Control. Jack Mitchell had never been a man who rushed into things blindly. If he'd taught me anything growing up, it was patience. When I was 14 and learning to shoot at the local range, I remember him correcting my aim. Slow down, he'd said quietly. The target isn't going anywhere. The same lesson applied here. If I was going to uncover the truth about what happened 40 years ago, charging forward would only slam doors in my face. So instead I started asking careful questions. The next morning I requested access to certain military archives through channels available to my rank. Nothing dramatic, just research related to historical NATO operations. Officially I framed it as academic interest. Unofficially I was following a trail. Over the next several days pieces started appearing. Some came from British records shared through NATO channels. Others came from American military documents that had recently been declassified. None of them told the whole story. But they told enough. The operation had taken place in the winter of 1984 near the border of East Germany. A British intelligence convoy had been ambushed while transporting several agents who had been extracted from Soviet territory. Communications collapsed. Support teams believed everyone inside the convoy had been killed. Then, according to the official report, Colonel Richard Halstead arrived with a small response unit and carried out a daring rescue. Except there was one strange detail buried in the documents. A brief mention of unidentified Allied personnel assisting during extraction. Unidentified. That was the only place the record hinted that someone else had been involved. I sat in the small records office staring at the screen while rain tapped softly against the windows. Unidentified Allied personnel. My father. He had been reduced to 3 anonymous words. For the next several days I dug deeper. Sir Malcolm had been telling the truth when he said the evidence existed. There were witness statements from British agents who had survived the ambush. One described an American operator who refused evacuation until all wounded were secured. Another mentioned the American who carried Major March out under fire. That American had no name in the report. Just a blank line where it had been removed. I sat there reading those statements until my eyes blurred. Not because I was surprised anymore. Because I could suddenly see my father in those lines. The quiet stubbornness. The refusal to leave someone behind. The part that hurt the most was realizing that he had probably come home afterward and said absolutely nothing about it. He had gone back to the marina. Back to fixing engines. Back to drinking coffee on the porch. While somewhere in Washington, Richard Halstead accepted medals for the mission. Late that evening, I stepped outside the building into the cool London air. The city was quieter at night. Rain drifted down softly under the streetlights. I pulled my phone from my pocket and searched for Halstead again. The latest articles described him as a retired intelligence advisor living in Virginia. Occasionally, he appeared at military events speaking about Cold War strategy and leadership. People respected him. Young officers admired him. He had built an entire reputation around the story that belonged to my father. I stood there for a long time watching the rain slide down the sidewalk. Revenge is a strange thing. Most people imagine it as something explosive, a confrontation, a shouted accusation. But standing there in the quiet London night, I realized that wasn't what I wanted. Not really. What I wanted was something simpler. The truth. If Colonel Richard Halstead had taken credit for my father's mission, then the truth had been buried long enough. And buried truths have a habit of rising eventually. The next morning I returned to the archive office and requested copies of every witness statement connected to the 1984 extraction. By the end of the week, I had something much stronger than anger. I had evidence. Enough to ask questions. Enough to make certain people uncomfortable. And enough to ensure that the next time I stood in a room with Richard Halstead, the conversation would not be about history. It would be about honesty. When my plane touched down back in the United States 2 weeks later, the air felt warmer, thicker, more familiar. The flight from London had been long enough to think through every possible version of what might happen next. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I realized something important. This wasn't really about revenge. At least not the kind people imagine. I wasn't interested in humiliating an old man or destroying a career that had already run its course. My father had raised me better than that. But truth mattered. And the truth about Jack Mitchell had been buried under someone else's reputation for nearly 40 years. That deserved daylight. When I arrived at Camp Lejeune, my commanding officer noticed something different about me right away. "Everything all right, Mitchell?" he asked during a routine briefing. "Yes, sir." "You look like someone who's planning something." That made me smile a little. "Just doing some reading, sir." He didn't push further. In the Marine Corps, people learn to recognize when someone is carrying a personal mission. The following weekend, I drove north toward Virginia. The trip from North Carolina to Arlington takes about 6 hours if traffic behaves itself. The highway ran straight through farmland, small towns, and long stretches of quiet forest. I had plenty of time to think. My father's voice came back to me more than once during that drive. He had a way of simplifying things. When I was young and came home angry about something, someone cheating in a school competition or a coach playing favorites, he used to say the same thing. "Focus on what's right, not what's loud." That sentence stayed with me the entire drive. Because Colonel Richard Halstead's life had been loud. Interviews, speeches, awards, articles about Cold War heroism. My father's life had been quiet. Boat engines, early mornings, coffee on a screened porch. And yet somehow the quiet man had been the one who carried a dying British officer 2 miles under gunfire. By the time I reached Arlington, dusk was settling over the city. The streets near the Potomac were lined with old trees, their branches arching over quiet neighborhoods filled with brick homes and white fences. Halstead's house wasn't hard to find. Public figures tend to leave footprints everywhere. It sat on a peaceful street just a few miles from Arlington National Cemetery, a neat 2-story house with a small front garden and a flag hanging beside the door. Nothing extravagant. In fact, it looked almost ordinary. I parked across the street and sat in the car for a few minutes, watching the lights inside the house. A television flickered through the living room window. Somewhere a dog barked. Part of me expected to feel anger again. Instead, I felt something calmer. Resolve. I stepped out of the car, walked up the path, and rang the doorbell. Footsteps approached after a moment. The door opened slowly. Colonel Richard Halstead was older than the photographs I had seen online. Time had bent his shoulders slightly, and his hair had thinned to a soft white halo above a lined face. But his eyes were sharp. Soldier's eyes. "Yes," he said. I stood straight out of habit. "Colonel Halstead." "That's right. My name is Sarah Mitchell." He studied me for a moment. "Have we met?" "No, sir." He glanced down briefly, and that's when he saw the ring. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His posture stiffened. For a long second, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "You'd better come inside." The living room was tidy and quiet, decorated with framed photographs and shelves of military books. Several medals hung in a glass case on the wall. Among them was one I recognized from the article I had read in London. The medal awarded for the 1984 extraction. Halstead noticed where my eyes landed. "You've done some research." "Yes, sir." He gestured toward a chair. "Sit down." I sat. He remained standing for a moment, staring at the ring again before finally lowering himself into the chair across from me. "How did you get that?" he asked quietly. "It belonged to my father." "And your father's name?" "Jack Mitchell." For the first time since I arrived, the old colonel's composure cracked. He leaned back slowly and closed his eyes. "Jack," he murmured. The name sounded like it carried decades of weight. "You knew him," I said. "Yes." Silence filled the room. Finally, he looked back at me. I wondered if this day would come. "You mean the day someone asked the right questions?" "Yes." His voice held no anger. "Just fatigue." You took credit for the mission, I said calmly. Halstead nodded. Yes. The directness of it surprised me. No excuses, I asked. Oh, there are excuses, he said with a faint smile. Government pressure, political convenience, the chaos of the Cold War. But those aren't the truth. Number. He looked at the metal case again. Your father saved my life. The room went completely still. You were there. Yes. And Edward March? Halstead nodded slowly. Jack carried him, refused to leave him behind. That's what I heard. The old colonel rubbed his hands together thoughtfully. The reports credited me because I was the ranking officer who survived, he said. Your father refused to testify publicly. He said recognition wasn't necessary. That sounds like him. But I knew the truth. Then why stay silent? Halstead looked at me for a long time before answering. Because once the story was written, correcting it would have exposed the operation, the agents we extracted, and the governments involved. That was 40 years ago. Yes. Things are different now. The old man sighed. Yes, they are. For several seconds we sat quietly across from each other. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I'm tired of carrying it. That sentence hung in the air between us. I never wanted revenge, I said carefully. I know. I just want the truth. Halstead nodded. And the truth deserves to be told. He stood slowly and walked toward the bookshelf. From a locked drawer he removed a folder thick with old documents. When he returned, he placed it on the table between us. Everything is in here, he said. Witness statements, operational reports, personal testimony. Enough to correct history. I placed my hand on the folder. For the first time since my father's funeral, I felt something close to peace. Because revenge had never really been the goal. Justice was. And justice sometimes begins with two people finally choosing honesty. I drove back to North Carolina with the folder on the passenger seat beside me, the way some people might carry a fragile family heirloom. In a way, that's exactly what it was. Not because the papers themselves were precious. Most were copies, typed reports, witness statements, internal summaries with sections blacked out years ago and later restored. No, what made them precious was what they returned to me. My father's name, his actions, his place in history. For nearly 40 years, Jack Mitchell had lived as if none of it mattered. He fixed engines, paid his bills, looked after my mother when she got sick, and raised me with a steady hand and a quiet example. He never once sat me down and said, "Let me tell you what I did when I was young." He never needed to. He believed character was built in ordinary days, not grand speeches. And yet as I drove south through Virginia and into North Carolina, I realized something else. Silence may protect peace for a while, but truth still matters. Not for vanity, not for glory, for memory, for fairness, for the people left behind who need to understand what was carried for them. Over the next few weeks, things moved more quickly than I expected. Colonel Halstead kept his word. He signed a statement confirming that the official record of the 1984 extraction had been incomplete and materially misleading. He admitted publicly through the proper military channels that my father had led the critical rescue under fire, carried Major Edward March, and refused evacuation until the remaining wounded were secured. He did not hide behind careful language. He did not try to soften what he had done. That mattered to me more than I thought it would. Maybe age teaches a person that confession, when it is sincere, has its own kind of dignity. British officials cooperated too. Sir Malcolm sent over corroborating records from their side, along with testimony from one of the surviving agents, an elderly man living quietly in Sussex, who wrote that my father had the calmest eyes in the worst chaos I had ever known. I must have read that sentence 20 times. The Pentagon reviewed the evidence. Then the Navy reviewed it. Then came the calls, the meetings, the formal language, the discussions about posthumous recognition and intergovernmental coordination, and the practical mechanics of correcting a record that had sat undisturbed for decades. Through all of it, I kept thinking how amused my father would have been by the fuss. He would have hated the suits. He would have hated the speeches. And he absolutely would have hated the idea of people polishing his memory like a silver trophy. But I hope he would have understood why I stayed with it. Because this wasn't about making him bigger than he was. It was about making the record honest. The ceremony took place that fall at a naval installation in Virginia, in coordination with British officials and a small delegation from London. The morning was cool and bright, one of those clear American days when the sky seems almost too blue to be real. I wore my marine dress blues again. This time, when I looked in the mirror before leaving the hotel, I understood something I hadn't fully understood in London. I wasn't just wearing my own service. I was carrying his too. The ceremony itself was simple by official standards, though still larger than my father would have preferred. A color guard stood at the front. Uniforms lined the rows. A Navy band played softly before the program began. There were admirals, diplomats, a few older veterans, and reporters seated farther back than I liked. But what mattered most to me wasn't any of that. It was the 3 old men from my father's funeral. They were there. I saw them near the front, older than ever, shoulders still straight. The tallest one caught my eye and gave a small nod as if to say, "About time." Colonel Halstead was there too. He looked older than when I had visited him, though maybe what I was really seeing was something else, the relief that comes when a man finally sets down a burden he has carried too long. When his turn came to speak, he did not dress the truth in pretty language. He stood at the podium and said in a steady voice, "For many years I allowed history to attach my name to actions that belonged to another man. Jack Mitchell saved lives that night, including mine. Whatever honor is offered today should have been offered long ago. No excuses, no hedging. Just truth." I respected him for that. Then a British representative read a letter sent on behalf of the Crown. It spoke of courage, alliance, sacrifice, and an act of loyalty that had never been forgotten by those whose lives were saved. Formal words, yes, but sincere ones. At the end, the representative stepped down and handed me a framed copy to keep. Then came the moment I had been carrying in my chest ever since London. My father's name was read aloud. Not buried. Not omitted. Not assigned to unidentified Allied personnel. Read aloud, clear and permanent. Senior Chief Jack Mitchell. For extraordinary courage under fire. For refusal to abandon Allied personnel. For service beyond recognition. I stood there with my hands clasped behind my back, marine still, while every feeling I had held in for months seemed to rise all at once. Grief, pride, relief, and something softer than all 3. Completion. At the end of the ceremony, they presented me with the medal and corrected citation on his behalf. Then, in a gesture arranged quietly beforehand, I was given a folded American flag and a small display case containing the restored documentation and the old signet ring. After the crowd thinned, I stepped away to a quieter corner beneath a stand of trees. Colonel Halstead found me there. For a minute, neither of us said anything. Then he looked at the case in my hands and said, "He deserved better." "Yes," I said, "he did." He nodded. "I can't undo the years." "No," I said, "but you helped tell the truth." His eyes looked tired but lighter. "I'm grateful you gave me the chance." That was the moment I understood revenge had fully left me. Because what stood in front of me was not an enemy. Just an old man who had failed and then finally chosen not to fail again. We shook hands. Not as friends exactly, but not as enemies either. Something closer to peace. A week later, I went home to North Carolina and sat on my father's screened porch with the evening wind coming in off the water. I placed the ring beside his old coffee mug and watched the light change over the yard. For a long time, I thought about what this whole thing had really been about. Not medals. Not government secrets. Not even correction. It was about the danger of letting convenience replace truth. About how easy it is for history to honor the louder man while forgetting the steadier one. And about how real service, is not measured by applause. My father taught me that without ever saying it outright. Do the right thing. Carry your share. Don't abandon people. And when truth finally asks for daylight, don't be afraid to open the door. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone quiet, decent, or too easily overlooked, I hope you'll carry that memory a little closer tonight. Share this story with someone who still believes character matters. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this told with heart and honesty, stay with me.